Well, I thank Ben and all the members of the Einstein Forum for having invited me to this discussion. So in about 10 days, I happen to have sat through 3 workshops, or less than 10 days, where 3 terms have been in circulation. BRICS, decolonization and epistemic justice together, and the neoliberal university. In an earlier meeting on Brazil at my university, on BRICS in my university, I was among scholars of international relations, and I was given a carte blanche rather than proceed with a philosophical argument on cognitive justice and the sciences, I decided to basically address the question of cognitive justice from the perspective of the philosophy of science. I myself live an ambivalent existence among scientists. I'm a social scientist, and among social scientists, I'm a scientist. All right, so I wear it's like non-alignment. It's the position of the weak. I was told by students of international relations. All right, and then in Bayreuth we recently discussed, some of us, the changing timescape of the neoliberal university. Now I wondered whether I should give my talk the title Challenges for the University in India, which is what I'm largely going to speak about. But I also think that the university today, more or less globally, is facing the same challenges in many ways, which is why the discussion on the rise of the neoliberal university is so important. All right, now, so the concern that emerged was how the new timescapes of the neoliberal university and the processes of decolonization were thinning out the curriculum of the university. But when speaking of the world of higher education, we seem to be within a semiotic triangle wherein these 3 terms are the corners of the triangle today. The neoliberal university, the question of decolonization, and epistemic justice. Now, the term, before I go to that, just a little anecdote. Before one entered the discussion on BRICS, or long before BRICS was formed, in 1984, a network was established. The meetings began in Delhi in December 1984, January 1985, amongst a group of historians and philosophers of science from India and China, and later joined from Brazil, Egypt, Mexico, China, Japan. They were not a BRICS formation or anything. They constituted themselves into a research group called the Science and Empires Program. And under this Science and Empires Program for 20 years, they basically sought a fitting response to Eurocentrism in the sciences. And a lot of the debates that I will talk about were debates which emerged within this group and other groups. So the terms decolonization and decoloniality have come to mean, as we have seen since yesterday, have come to mean many things, and in fact, they mean different things in distinct regional and national contexts. And then there is postcolonialism, postcoloniality, postcolonial theory, and history, which are terms more restrictive in their usage, having been in currency for some time. And as Ben said yesterday, it was in vogue during our formative years, and we identified with it, and at times we did not wish to belong to a club that would accept us as members. So we always had this ambivalent relationship with postcolonial theory. Nevertheless, the terms still lend themselves to a spectrum of interpretive variation, though not as much as terms like decoloniality. And there are terms with which I have to deal with when I address these issues in my writing, such as indigenous knowledge systems, the indigenous sciences, sometimes referred to as IKS, but the IKS depends upon who is talking, is sometimes capitalized and sometimes not. And IKS, when capitalized, refers to, the term was basically coined to refer to knowledge of the first peoples. All right? But the term is now used in more than one context, or has been used in more than one context, even by left-wing historians in the 1970s and 80s, the indigenous knowledge systems of India. And that is not quite the same thing as IKS capitalized. So, all right, even here then, the usage of the term IKS varies across nations, regions, continents. And the historian and philosopher of science finds herself encountering a semantic field, knowing full well that the signifier is recognized, but wonders what holds them together. All right, in this semantic field, I would add, after today's discussion, the term recolonization. Now, it is this relationship that I shall attempt to address. A referee responding to a paper I recently sent to a very reputed journal objected to my concurring with Gurminder Bhamra's claim that post-colonial theory and decoloniality were connected sociologies. And that one might add, I would add, were premised on connected theories of knowledge. In fact, I was rapped on the knuckles for not understanding that decoloniality had defined itself in opposition to post-colonial theory. But I would still maintain with Bhamra that these are indeed connected sociologies, although they allude to very different historical experiences. But we do indeed need to recognize that the colonial experience across regions and continents has not been homogeneous. And in fact, while the variations are stark between regions that were victims of settler colonialism and those of colonialism by conquest, there are variations within these two large rubrics as well. And this plays itself out in the wide variety of decolonization projects. So I'm using decolonization as different from decoloniality, that contemporary universities across the world are witnessing. In any case, the convergence of these two theoretical movements is the attempt to break free of the rules, the hierarchies, the imaginaries imposed by colonial power, and the epistemic violence it has, or even epistemic injustice, it has afflicted with regard to the worlds of knowledge, the use of language, of history, etc. Now, from a science perspective, the early history of post-colonialism, especially in its Scythian incarnation, was inspired in part by the work of Gramsci, the Foucaultian term, the work of several generations of anthropologists of knowledge, and that centered for historians of and philosophers of science the relevance of framing knowledge power. In fact, my criticism of a number of students doing history of science from my own university has always been this preoccupation with knowledge power. Now, these developments were more or less concurrent with the challenge posed by post-Kuhnian science studies and feminist philosophies of science. So these are the three historiographic revolutions of the 1980s that changed the way we think of the relationship between science and society. Post-colonial theory of science, post-colonial science studies, and feminist philosophy of science. More or less, yeah. All these strands combine to pose a major challenge to scientific objectivity and the Eurocentric history of sciences. In the 1990s, however, the feminist philosophers of science, some feminist philosophers of science, would do an about turn. They were the ones who first took up the question of scientific objectivity and would attempt to articulate another notion of objectivity. They were not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Another notion of objectivity that Sandra Harding would call strong objectivity. All right? And of course, many of you would have seen the work of Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison and others who give us a history of objectivity itself. All right? So when they talk of scientific objectivity, they were not, in the 1990s, they were not talking of the same thing that we were talking of in the 1950s or the 1960s. So this challenge to the Eurocentric history of science sought to reconstitute the identity of modern science and disentangle it from its purely Western origins. All right? The title of the well-known work by George Saliba, for example, is indicative of the same, namely, The Islamic Roots of the European Scientific Renaissance. All right? Or the other important work from the same genre, of course, was Martin Bernol's Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Western Civilization, that inspired, in some circles, Afrocentrism. Now, post-colonial theory, in its attempt, and I see the post-colonial theory of science to have three important premises, which it articulates quite clearly. It involves a theory of science, a theory of history, and a theory of transmission. And in the discussion, maybe I can set them out. So, in its attempt to reinvent the narrative of the origins of modern science in the history of knowledge, it rejected the one-sided diffusionist history that underpinned accounts of the expansion of the European sciences, highlighting, important, the hybrid nature of modern science. And this trend seems to have continued into the more recent work of, it is contested, but I think it's a good piece of work, of the historian at Warwick, James Poskett, who's written a book called The Global History of the Sciences, in which, of course, he talks about the fundamental role of the knowledge of the Aztecs and the Mayans in the making of modern science. Now, but these ideas of this hybrid science, or to use a term from the 1980s from the historian of science, Joseph Needham, ecumenical science, the metaphor, the river metaphor, the hybrid nature of modern science, animated studies of my generation of historians of science who were suspicious of centrisms and certain kinds of origin myths. However, in the contemporary discussion on decolonization in South Asia, and I suppose elsewhere, the importance of the anti-colonial struggle and the process of political decolonization is often underplayed. For the complex process in the contemporary discussion on decolonization is reduced to merely the achievement of political sovereignty, what Joachim was calling decolonization 2, which was political decolonization. One, sorry. Okay. Yeah, no, for me it's 2 because I have another, I'll come to that. All right. But this decolonization did not mount a significant or proportional challenge to the cultural, intellectual, and speaking of the university, the disciplinary hegemony of the West, propagated through that central institution of Western imperium, the university. Now, I think this is too broad in general a dismissal of the relationship between the academy and the processes of political decolonization. All right, in fact, I'm saying that there was a certain intellectual decolonization which began in the 1950s, although it was premised on the idea of science as a cultural universal. But there was this process. And when we examine, especially in India, the developments of economics, history, sociology, and anthropology, many of which began decolonizing themselves even before the region became independent of colonial rule. Furthermore, these narratives, or the contemporary narratives, I'm talking of decolonization, in these narratives, the importance of the scientific humanism of UNESCO of the 1950s and the role of Lucien Febvre, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Joseph Needham, and so many others, and Needham's networks across the globe, and so many others, in shaping the history of mankind project and reimagining world history in a non-Eurocentric way, and in the process deconstructing the patrimony of science, modern Western science, as modern but not Western, appears to be forgotten to contemporary memory. Although subsequent generation of scholars would depart in their understanding from that of the Needhamians. I remember when my colleague Irfan and I published a book, Dialogues with Joseph Needham, Joachim would often tease me and say, it should be called Disputations with Joseph Needham. Okay, so what is forgotten is the connected picture of the evolution of knowledge on the global scale that continued to aspire, either knowingly or unknowingly, the endeavors of historians into the 1990s, well before global history, Sanjay Subramaniam's connected history, before these ideas acquired currency. Nevertheless, some South Asian post-colonial theorists of the 1970s and 1980s, while not discounting the importance of political decolonization, pushed for a process of intellectual decolonization in the search for alternatives to a failing project of modernization and development. In other words, intellectual decolonization was the precondition for the reconstruction of an alternate political and developmental imagination that would provide a bulwark to the hegemony of the West decades after the passing of colonialism. But in this call for intellectual decolonization, there was the recognition, in the words of the novelist Mahashweta Devi in India, the West within the East. This was something which was recognized. Although there was more than a rhetorical romanticization of the Indian past and the intellectual resources of the subcontinent, distorted by the Orientalist project and delegitimated by the modernist project. You would remember the book by Ashish Nandi called The Intimate Enemy, The Loss and Recovery of the Self Under Colonialism. The current project of decolonization often evokes this critique while at the same time sanitizing it of the complex and entangled histories which it sought to visibilize. The critique was a nuanced one and acknowledged, I'm talking of the 1980s, the emergence of post-colonial theory in history, and acknowledged both the hybrid nature of modern science and the diversity of the systems of knowledge of the subcontinent. Again, in the current phase of decolonization, this critique is instrumentalized in an indigenist move that rejects hybridity, diversity, and connectedness, arguing for a pristine Indian knowledge system distinct in several ways from all other knowledge systems, and overlooking the idea that civilizational knowledges are fundamentally connected knowledges. In other words, there is a return to the essentialism of Orientalism of an Indian essence. In fact, I would further argue there is a process of a double enfranchisement in the construction of what will be taught as Indian knowledge systems in courses. will not contain any reference to the knowledge systems of the Islamic world, which are also part of Indian history. I remember many decades ago, the Spanish historian of science, Joseph Simon, once told me that, Dhruv, in a book on the history of Spanish philosophy, we start in the 17th century and not with Al-Mamun. All right? So this is something we see, that there's a sanitization of the great Islamic philosophers who also are part of India's historical legacy, just like all the little traditions from the medieval period or probably earlier are also not part of this tradition. It is in this sense that the current meaning of decolonization in South Asia upends the earlier three moments of decolonization that rejected any form of essentialism or essentialization. So what I would argue, elsewhere I argue that there are three moments or four essential movements of decolonization one can talk of in South Asia. One starting in the 1890s and going into the 1920s. The second is political decolonization. The third is the emergence of post-colonial theory in the 1980s. And the fourth is the indigenism that we see now. So thus decolonization, becomes a form of recolonization. Under the pretext of decolonization, the university system in contemporary India is now undergoing a radical structural and curricular change. As in many parts of the world, the humanities and the social sciences are either in a state of neglect or are in a state of decline. Universities are no longer recruiting faculty in particular disciplines, political sciences in particular. And courses on Indian knowledge systems are being introduced across the board in colleges to the neglect of rigorous courses on Indian philosophy. But what passes for Indian knowledge systems comprises a salad of several darshanas or the 6 schools of Indian philosophy, and not what I'll refer to as the Nirgrantha schools of Indian philosophy, or those schools of Indian philosophy that are based on the idea that there is no revealed text. At a global level, the study of capitalized IKS or indigenous knowledge systems have acquired visibility from Canada to Africa, Latin America, and Australia. And a colleague of mine and I have published a paper on basically the rise of studies on indigenous knowledge systems in these parts of the world. But in these cases, it is the knowledge of so-called first peoples that is being discussed. But capitalized IKS in India has come to refer to Indian knowledge systems. Okay. So what is on offer in these courses is not the sources of agricultural knowledge possessed by farming communities across the country about crop varieties, soils, the weather, herbs, water harvesting techniques, which science has recognized are also central to any discourse on sustainability, and that could be spliced in, as Susanta Gunutilike once put it, into modern sustainable techniques. So these courses in knowledge systems and other are like Mambo number 5. A little bit of Vedanta for the night, a little bit of Nyaya now and then. Without imparting the serious philosophical commitments of Indian philosophy and its contributions to epistemology, ontology, ethics at large. Or even how it could be looped into some of the contemporary scientific concerns, for example, as was done by computer scientists in the 1990s when they commenced work on knowledge representation in Sanskrit. It could well be argued that the intent of these courses is to ideologically instrumentalize Indian knowledge systems through a narrative of what we've been talking about before, neglect and victimization, to reinforce and reassert a nativist selfhood in opposition to other knowledge forms, contravening the idea of the university as a universe of knowledge. In other words, the high traditions of Indian philosophical thought trump the little traditions. And contrary to the spirit of engaging with IKS, this kind of decolonization renders the anthropologists capitalized IKS to a status of subalternity and marginality. As the indigenous high tradition seeks to colonize the world of learning, severing it from the larger projects of achieving social justice, cultivating global citizenship and democracy. These are all the ingredients, these three are the ingredients feminist philosophy of science has reminded us repeatedly are important components of the process of the production of another term from Sandra Harding, robust knowledge, and the furthering of strong objectivity. So I would like to supplement Bodhi's thesis of decoloniality, not by adding some more, but by bringing in some clarification from the philosophy of science. The first is that, in the Indian context, in the light of the minimalist definition I have adopted for decoloniality, we could count 4 different moments of decolonization in South Asia. And the first goes back to the period I have said extending from 1890 to 1920s, when Indians struggled to alter the mandate of the colonial university, which was an examining body. That's all. All right? And as Bernie Cohen has told us, it was designed to solve the problem of colonial governmentality. And what the struggle demanded over those 3 decades was that we want a university of teaching and research with a revised curriculum formulated by a relatively autonomous academic community. So the universities established, as different from the universities established between 1857 and 1900, the universities established in the first decades of the 20th century, I have elsewhere called the second generation universities in India, were themselves an act of decolonization. And this is part of our history which we seem to have forgotten today when we talk about decolonizing. And I'd like to develop this point further. This hypothesis, for me, was further confirmed by a couple of Kenyan scholars whom I was very glad to interact with at the Cluster of Excellence, Africa, Europe, thanks to Iris sitting here at the University of Bayreuth. They pointed out to me on several occasions, because of you Indians, we in Kenya got the university very late. When I asked why, I was told that it were Indian settlers in Kenya who raised the demand for the university to be established in Kenya. The colonial officials procrastinated. The reason being that we gave them a university to civilize and educate them, and they turned it into a site of anti-colonial struggle. And so don't give the Kenyans a university. In the contemporary sense, then, decolonizing the university is an oxymoron. Because in a broader sense, it was always a site for the decolonization of knowledge through its own slow but nevertheless internal dynamic. Any external intervention would be a colonization. The cosmopolitan university at any moment is a site for many decolonizing projects. This is something that the Trumpists in America have learned. The second aspect has to do with the idea of decolonization as a return to an undistorted past. The underlying assumption that any mediation by an external source, given the experience of colonialism, only contaminates what is considered to be indigenous knowledge. It distorts it. But there is no unmediated access to any past. Knowledge transmitted internally, as Stitchway and others have reminded us, through an iterative praxis, undergoes transformation, even internally. And it is well nigh impossible to restore a text to its original pristine purity, no matter how hard the philologists try. Political animals we may well be, but we dwell in an endlessly interpreted world. We have before us, and this is my favorite example, a number of examples of failed attempts to understand classical Greek philosophers and what I'm concerned about, Ptolemy, unmediated by the Arab translations into Latin after the fall of Constantinople and the beginnings of the classical Renaissance. The inability to do anything with the directly translated Ptolemy is a case in point. It was Regiomontanus, then finally, at Nuremberg, who was asked to prepare an edition which summarized all the Arabic translations in order to make sense of Ptolemy again in Europe. And it is this text of Regiomontanus, with the Arab commentaries going with it, that Copernicus reads, and the ideas of the astronomers at Moraga reach Europe. All right? So, the last point I would like to raise is that the cultural studies of science, in a particular context, launched a criticism of science and scientism, which in a way was perfectly in order, for the standard account did not provide an adequate description of the practice of the sciences and the complex relationship between science and society. Furthermore, the science had over centuries had been instrumentalized in delegitimating other ways of knowing. This aspect of science's engagement with what is referred to as OKS, other knowledge systems, has been recognized by UNESCO's Science Vision 2035 document. But what indiscriminate decolonization pursues is the reinstatement of anything as knowledge or a knowledge system, forgetting that all knowledge systems have procedures of validation and certifying what counts as knowledge. In its attempt to decolonize knowledge, the epistemic instrument of decolonization is radical alterity, enabled by a political vision that catalogs these knowledge systems as victimized by imperial power, victims of epistemological violence. Without elaborating upon this point further, I discuss in a forthcoming paper that in our engagement with nature and techniques, we do not have an infinity of technologies or ways of knowing or acting upon the world. In a classic paper written by the philosopher of technology, Walter Vincenty, following the initial buzz around the social constructivism of science and technology, Vincenty pointed out, please, let me tell you, you do not have an infinite number of designs for the undercarriage of an aircraft which can land safely. There are just a limited number of designs we have. In like manner, I don't think we have an infinite number of ways of knowing. All right? On the contrary, what we do have is a family resemblance of a plurality of partially overlapping ways of knowing that ensures bridges of understanding across cultures and languages. Unfortunately, when Paul Feyerabend was arguing against foundationalism and making a case for theoretical pluralism and competing theories, he was seen as an icon of postmodernism and not providing arguments for a defense of scientific realism. As argued elsewhere, the encounter between other knowledge systems and modern science need not be one which is antagonistic. And this is one of the nicer points that Boaventura Santos makes. We have an insistence of the manner in which, for example, Chinese traditional medicine engaged with modern medicine, each side recognizing the limits and prospects of the respective system of having some shared idea, if not an identical one, of what constitutes knowledge. The same can be said in the late 19th century attempts of P.S. Warrior in Kerala and the Kottakkal Arya Vaidyashala to revitalize Ayurveda, and the attempts of Hakim Ajmal Khan in Delhi to revitalize Unani. Were we to ignore these exemplars, both the university and the knowledge production system will become vulnerable, as we are discovering with the spread of ignorance and what the science of the spread of ignorance or agnotology has alerted us to. As somebody interested in the epistemological aspect of the sciences and social sciences and the consequences for the knowledge production system, as the balkanized social media amounts a major assault with the spread of ignorance, we must at the same time recognize there are aspects of decolonizing the university in which we would need to participate. This week I spent 4 days with academics from South African universities in Bayreuth, and they all, both black and white scholars, spoke of the measly presence of black academics almost 30 years after the ending of apartheid in the university. These are aspects that require serious engagement. But sociologists are better qualified to speak about them than I can. I have elsewhere argued, drawing on the work of Boaventura Santos and Shiv Vishwanathan, that social justice cannot be achieved without cognitive justice and vice versa. But in this struggle, perhaps it would be prudent now to give up the idea of the global south and the global north, since the knowledge production system is vulnerable in both geographies of knowledge, which means we would need a set of epistemic virtues to complement the old Mertonian ones, while recognizing that the neoliberal university has played a role in reconfiguring the knowledge game into what John Simon and others have called post-academic science. I have no ideas what these new virtues might be. But in the light of the direction in which decolonization of the universities is proceeding, from the Indian context, my first list would include the recognition of the diversity of knowledge forms, theoretical pluralism, and the connectedness of histories. This is one way to counter the indigenism and relativism that underlies some of these decolonization projects. These are, of course, provisional suggestions, and I have attempted to derive them from post-colonial theory and feminist philosophy of science, and may help remedy an essentialist or indigenous decolonization. But this is likely to be ineffective if this is not recognized in what Ben called the West Global North yesterday. Thank you very much.
We open the floor to questions. There are two questions here in front. Gentleman here.
Well, thank you for this very interesting talk. I have many questions, but let me just ask three. Maybe you can. The first one is, you know the difference in German between Geisteswissenschaft and Naturwissenschaften und Technikwissenschaften. When you talk about knowledge and science of knowledge, do you refer also to the humanities, what we would call cultural sciences or Geisteswissenschaft? That is the first question. How large is the context? Second point, there is, I think, a fundamental difference between knowledge, where you would say knowledge that means analytical knowledge, and knowledge how. For example, in education, in medicine, in law, this practical knowledge, the knowledge how, is extremely important. It's one of the aspects you mentioned about diversity of knowledge. And the third aspect, which I'm very interested in, is wisdom. You know it, that I have been working on this idea, and a rediscovery of the importance of wisdom, but also in reference to scientific knowledge. And I wonder if you have a few ideas about the difference. of these two concepts?
Yeah, I don't
So
know.
much I know.
I don't know whether I can answer the third question, despite my grey beard. I don't know whether I can speak about wisdom, but let me see. Let me get to your first question. In the Anglophone world, somehow, we have been part of our colonial inheritance has been a strong distinction between the sciences and the humanities and social sciences, all right? And in some sense, within the university, following the Methodist Rite in Europe, and then much later the Popper-Adorno debate, although we now know that Popper and Adorno agreed on more things than they disagreed about, but yet the Popper-Adorno debate sort of drew a boundary, a methodological boundary through the sciences and the social sciences, and in the training of the natural sciences and the social scientists. And of late I've been writing less about history and more about philosophy or philosophy of science, and I have been arguing that on both sides of this divide, there are misapprehensions about what the other is doing. For example, scientists don't think that their tasks are interpretive. And we do know, after Kuhn and Patrick Helon and others, that science too has its own hermeneutic. All right? So when I'm talking about this, I am not going along with this divide anymore, although I was trained along that. So that's my first question. So that's one. The second is, thanks to the influence of Joachim, I became aware of the work of Christian Jakob and others, and it's also part of a larger trend in the history of science, where suddenly, in science studies particularly, when people are beginning to re-profile themselves not so much as historians of science, as historians of knowledge, because the term science itself is too institutionally loaded. All right? So that's my answer to your second question. The question of wisdom, I'm not wise enough at the moment to answer that. But I think what you refer to as wisdom is a kind of knowledge which is collective and not individual. It's something which resides within a community and ensures a certain resilience and strategies of survival, which, time tested over long periods of time. That I would put in that category of wisdom, but I haven't thought about it too much.
Thank you very much.
Hi, this question comes from an anonymous Zoom participant. That's the name here. You say that your generation began with a fascination for hybrid histories of science against origin myths. Do you still feel that hybrid is a useful qualifier for histories of science? Does the concept of hybrid not carry with it an origin myth of its own in its compulsion to therefore engage with that of the pure breed?
Okay. We have to think in context, right? We become wise only retrospectively. So when we began, my generation, the histories of China and India and, in history books were added chapters in a history book. So there was a chapter on Greek science, there was a chapter on Indian science, and then the rest of the book was the sciences of Europe. That was the point at which we began. And the notion of hybridity at that moment began to puncture that vision. All right? Whether I would use the term hybrid today, perhaps not. But at that time, these were the first steps. It's very easy to be wise afterwards. All right, retrospectively but yes, I see the question. But at that time, those were the first steps in deconstructing the Eurocentric history of sciences.
Is there an immediate question from the floor? If not, I will abuse my privilege to actually bring this into a slightly retrospective discussion. I suppose it follows from the question that came from the internet, but it seems to me that the constructing of the histories and the genealogies of knowledges are still suffering from what I might call a very reactive process. So in the sense that regardless of what you're studying, the ghost of what has gone before and its apparent or actual epistemic injustice is still with us. You started off by saying, well, there was a book by Ashish Nundy in the beginning, as it were. But the book by Ashish Nundy, in fact, starts with a phrase which I still find very offensive. And it says, I am here to defend the innocence of the colonized. Now, I don't know what the epistemology of innocence might look like, but it's certainly something that always struck me. There's nothing more colonized, or if I can quote Joachim, nothing more conducive to the perpetuation of an inferiority complex than chasing after the tail of bygone forms of knowing and continuously dragging it back into the room in some ways by insisting that what we're doing is reacting to that. And I have a non-history of science thought on this. Something called critical race theory, which was a minor set of footnotes in some obscure legal scholars' not very well-read books, was then anointed by some kind of right-wing ideologue as the main threat to Western civilization. Now, instead of ignoring this right-wing internet troll in disguise, what most of the left did was not only respond to it very strongly, but run around writing syllabuses for something called critical race theory, thereby bringing something entirely fictitious into sudden and violent being. And I'm wondering whether some of what we did in academia over the years is to behave very reactively. And when we now complain that we've got to the stage where the reaction to nothing is to produce a form of nothing that addresses a form of nothing, is problematic. I wonder whether we could have seen it coming.
Yeah, you know, I mean, if you look at that moment where there was this reflection again on the relationship of science and society, etc., I think there was a larger social crisis to which this condition, this reflection arose. Just like I think decolonization today is a response to something very fundamental. And the larger social crisis then was, you know, I mean, in the words of the Pakistani poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, "Ye wo subha to nahi." This is not the dawn we had anticipated. All right, 20 years, we had committed ourselves to a project of development, of modernization, and it has not delivered. And why has it not delivered? And, well, there were many reasons which were offered, and one was often that the agenda is set somewhere else. All right, the agenda is set perhaps by the World Bank, perhaps by this, perhaps by that, and we therefore really haven't been able to, embark upon a path we would like to have embarked upon. So I think it was this, therefore, the 1970s were a period where you returned to Mao and you returned to Gandhi, and you had a very funny combination in India of a recuperation of neo-Gandhi, neo-Mao. If Mao read the way they read Mao, and if Gandhi read the way they read Gandhi, they wouldn't recognize themselves. But Gandhi and Mao were the people they turned to in order to look for a new starting point. All right? So I think this reflection became that in which the bad guy, the conspirator, was the West.
Hans.
Thanks a lot. I have a remark to make, not about science, and it's more about knowledges, so to say, in the plural, right? And I'm not an anthropologist, but let me try to try and speak on behalf of anthropology, because there may be something legitimate in, and you actually alluded to that, there may be something legitimate in looking at local knowledges and looking at how crop is being produced, what sort of breeding techniques you have in certain cultural pockets, right? Shipbuilding, rhetorics that have never been scripted but exist all the same, may be very, very complicated. I had supervised some of that kind of work, right? Where you have very complicated rhetorics underlying, for example, Islamic sermons in Bangladesh. So that sort of thing should be investigated. Anthropologists and people like us in textual studies or in language studies do that sort of thing. And I think there's some legitimacy in that, as long as, and this is where my question comes in, as long as it's not sold off as, say, alternative knowledges to some sort of scientific worldview, and put in opposition to that, but as long as you can sort of interlink them, make them talk to one another, and then it may be very useful to do these, even very necessary to do these things. So I wanted to make this point because I think it deserves mention also.
No, I totally agree with you. Actually, I think in the history of technology, I mean, about 50 of us came together to produce a volume called The Global History of Techniques, edited by Jean Carmino and Lillian Helen Perez. And we called it a global history of techniques. Now, the thing is, for historians of technology, there is a remarkable distinction between techniques and technology. Techniques belongs to the prehistory of technology. All right? And now historians of technology are saying, hey, that's not working. All right, I mean, so they wish to drop the term technology altogether and go back to Marcel Mauss's definition of techniques, of the way people act upon the world in order to cope and survive and live their lives. And so this whole thing, so that also brings me to a point you were raising about episteme and techne, that distinction. And I think these people are saying we don't want that distinction. Technology is not episteme plus techne. All right? I mean, so maybe we should not be thinking of techniques purely in terms of techne and, you know, leave the science to episteme. That distinction perhaps is not working. So what I like about this is that this book we produced is a book we produced for engineering colleges and schools all over the world. All right, in a way, you can rethink and re-educate engineers and others about how to think about techniques. So you're right. I mean, I mean, we don't.
Indigenous as a term may be burned, but then we
Yeah.
have other terms coming in, like vernacular, for example, which will also be burned.
Yeah, I know.
Can you say that again into the mic, Hans, because we're online. So.
Indigenous as a term has been burned, pretty much like native. Now we have something like vernacular, but I'm not sure that's going to be lasting for long. I think it's going to be burned as well. But the concern about the local is still there. That's what I wanted to add.
No, I agree with you, but I also think that the capitalized indigenous had a certain political importance. And the political importance, it had to do with the struggles of indigenous people for their rights. You know? So indigenous the indigenous knowledge systems refer to the struggles of indigenous people, not only for their rights, but the knowledge they possessed, which was now being patented by bioprospecting companies and others. So there was a certain political dimension to the indigenous earlier on.
Anastasia.
I think the political dimension of the indigenous has really come back big time. I mean, Modi's making Hinduism the world's biggest indigenous religion. It's not really working very well for him. You know, it's been kind of around as an axial age religion for a long time. But at the same time, in the social sciences, any term that refers to anything local has been delegitimated. So it's really, really difficult to find terms that refer to something that isn't sort of the Western gone global. Euro-American, you choose your term. It's also impossible to refer to the Western, which is actually an ethnographic term used quite widely around the world. It's not a term used in the West to refer to oneself, but it is a term used in the post-Soviet space, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Africa and so on. But it is, I think it is fascinating that you can't say local anymore because that's sort of derisory towards the people. You can't say native, you can't say
Not
indigenous, you can't say vernacular. Sorry?
Not within science studies. Within
Yeah,
science
is that a good
studies,
thing still?
Yeah, local works. I mean,
Right, yeah.
from Peter
In
Gallison
anthropology, you're essentializing. So the search for indicating the local.
Is there another question? Yeah, there's Iris at the back.
I just want to add to that because I'm not sure whether local works, because what we have not thought about now is about class, or however you will call it, about status groups, and because lots of things, like we talked about the university, for example, and that and decolonize university, for example, but it's not that university, for example, in Germany has not to be decolonized, because we have one of the most unfair education systems worldwide in Germany, for example. So it works for some, and therefore local is maybe not right. Even in the local, it works for some, but for lots not. And I think this is, again, when we started with this question also of power or status or class, or however we want to call it.
So if there's no other immediate question on the paper, I would propose that we move to a brief general discussion, because one of the reasons, if no, you can stay here. We're in the position. We don't have a round table, so you can move if you want. All we need is a microphone. So, yes, we have chairs. Yes. And anyway. So one of the things I had imagined when we started talking about post-colonial, decolonial, and its instrumentalization is to actually ask the question about what certain kinds of terminology do to force us into acknowledging them as the kind of starting and end point of all discussion. And we have inhabited various normative moves, even in short academic careers. And we have inhabited a situation where we are constantly challenged by this notion that there are certain moral and ethical things that we must place on the table as a kind of expiation before we're allowed to say anything. And I had the sense that for some people, even the idea that to decolonize is not universally a good thing, or that it might at least be ambiguous, is something that they would prefer not to be placed in the position of having to acknowledge in public. I have a term for things like this, and I call it shibboleths. So shibboleths are when you have to pronounce the right shibboleth before you're allowed to proceed at all. And if you place yourself outside that community, then you have effectively silenced yourself. Now, I wonder if we've done anything here at all other than do the normal academic thing of getting together and complaining about a set of terms. And we don't have to have an answer to that now. But it's a question that remains open. We have found that a term itself doesn't help us. And so all our little last discussion about what to call knowledge systems that do not conform to the hegemonic system becomes an interesting exercise in recognizing the futility of finding standardized terms. But that's just me.
I wonder if I could raise a question as an outsider, which is kind of similar, but in a different vocabulary. It really struck me. So I am, by background and training, a philosopher. I work in ancient Greek and classical Indian philosophy. Abstraction and conceptual complexity are my bread and butter. Now, I found quite a lot of the talk challenging. I could follow it. I could make it intelligible. When things were quoting, when people were quoting this morning, you had a lot of quotes from the decolonialists. I found them impossible to actually make sense of. And yet the decolonization is, by all accounts, extremely successful outside of the academy. So its success, it seems to me, can't be based on the quality of his arguments. If that's right, what's to be gained by making apparent the weaknesses of the arguments, which requires, as you say, engaging in a highly technical, virtually unintelligible moving around of various glass beads in order to get them all into place to show how incoherent this other thing is. We've got pressing practical concerns that are being enacted through the deployment of this vocabulary. Is there some other way to meet it? Which I think, Ben, might be your question in slightly different terms.
Two here, Anastasia, and then Hans.
Yes, this follows directly. I think a number of questions can be very gainfully asked and addressed. Not so much the history of decolonialism, that can be a minor caveat, interesting, and fine. But what's being done in the world through these categories? How are they deployed? What are indeed their weaknesses? You know, the empty signifier. I mean, bloody hell. I mean, there's a lot going on through this category in Hong Kong and China, right? There's a lot going on in Ukraine. They're like critical parts of the world. And inside academia, absolutely. But really, it would be very good to perhaps publish something, as we were saying yesterday evening, and I could actually see that this would actually be worth my while, which I'm very, very infrequently now convinced of, you know, in terms of any kind of academic writing project. But I think this really is a force in the world, and it's a force that's very poorly understood, and it's sort of emotively responded to, right, because it just sounds like it's such a lovely thing, but a lot of pretty bad things are happening, you know, forceful things, and some of them are indeed pretty bad. And I think it would be worth getting out and getting people some clarity about it.
Hans.
I think one of the advantages of decoloniality or decolonizing is that it is so evocative. So we know we don't want colonialism, right? Decoloniality, decolonial, etc., implies that you do some sort of wellness cure. You peel yourself, you get it off your skin, and that's what people want. It speaks immediately to the senses, I would say, even though it's Latin derived. But I mean, it speaks, right? It has evocative power, and therefore you don't possibly have to understand all the details inside that box. It's a black box, but it has it's a good term. It's a very handy term. So I wanted to make this point.
But just because it's such a handy term, it is so attractive, not only outside of academia, but also within. So I think there is a space to do something like what he did this morning, to basically point out the argumentative poverty. I know that's not satisfying to a philosopher, but for a historian of ideas, we need to do that. Oh, I did find it very good. But so, no, I think we should do it, and then of course we should also think about these things, why it's so appealing, morally, aesthetically, and also sort of, and to set up groups and sort of define your own identity. So I think that's actually fun to do, and we should do it somehow. The question is sort of, should we do it on post-colonialism and decoloniality together? Because they are, as we learn, very different things, right? And I think
yes and no.
and so I think the reason why I'm asking is with post-coloniality or post-colonial studies or what's left of it, many of us would say, okay, that there's something that's worth preserving, and then we're the defenders of the old order. Whereas if we just sort of go after the decolonial, then we're not the defenders of the old order. Sort of we wash our hands from the old order. We just say we look at this new trend and critique it. So just strategically, I don't know what's smarter to do.
No, I think it's also important not to replicate the decolonial strategy, painting everything in the same broad brush and having like a us-them picture. Because I think if we conflate all the different shades, then there's a problem, because I think we are just reproducing that, just inverting the values and not displacing them. So for me, it will be much more interesting to, what was, for me, the great part of this symposium was just pure joy of learning the empirical details of each case, right? And to be able to understand that that the theoretical surface cannot be a smooth space. We cannot just drag, as you were saying, the empty signifiers across, seamlessly. That historical depth and specificity matters. So that's my takeaway from all the discussion. And thank you for such great presentation.
I wanted to add 2 sentences to what I just said. One more important keyword for me is nostalgia, because we're living in an age of extinction debates, extinction of species, of cultures, right? And so decolonization seems to carry the promise to restore the world to its original, pristine plurality in some sense. Let's be different again.
I have a volume title, Innocent Decolonialism. I actually, so in terms of just thinking practically, I actually think focusing on decolonialism would be good, as opposed to, post-colonialism, because it's a bag, and also not very much has been achieved outside very narrow and boring academic seminar circles through the term post-colonialism. I mean, it's not been taken up as a political project, outside the political economy of the academy, whereas this has really, I mean, it is interesting where the rhetorical and the political force of that lies, right? And some of the things you're suggesting maybe, but I think each one of the cases that we deal with, what was really indeed exciting is seeing how it works in the world, and it bloody well works, right? And it's very different, and that is a very, very important thing to articulate and to think about. So
just 2 words. I would like to reassert this point that it's very important to think the different historical cultures, because, for instance, one of the possible meanings of to decolonize is to go back to a situation previous to colonization. Well, in the case of Brazil, Brazil simply did not exist previous to its colonization. So where are we going back to? So one thing that is happening in Brazil, and that's what I try to go against, is black movements think about decolonization in this sense by effacing their identity as Brazilians and forging an identity as Africans, which for a normal Brazilian simply doesn't exist. It's a fiction, it's an academic fiction that makes no sense for the population. So you said, and I agree with you partly, that the colonial discourse is very successful, right? But in Brazil, at least, it's very successful in small groups, very educated in the university, in the humanities. But in the whole society, it's almost exotic. And the whole society is reacting against it. And it's reacted towards the extreme right.
Joachim, did you want to add
I
something?
might, but you want maybe also to... I mean, one thing, picking up on what Francisco was saying, I mean, Hong Kong was a rock before it was colonized. I mean, there was nothing.
Yes.
Right? And just like that. And so we have this strange thing sort of going back to the year 1500 as if nothing happened. It's kind of, it's a, I think Zygmunt Bauman called it this retrotopia, right? It's a retrotopian vision. You go back to a past that never was and never could have been. And in that sense, it's interesting that sort of, I look at sort of fundamentalist Confucians who basically like the Taliban and the Guardian Council in Iran, and they also have a retrotopian vision to go back to the empire as if the 20th century hadn't happened. And so the decolonial seems to be part of a global trend that with different vocabularies sort of tries to imagine an escape to a past that never was. And I think that's interesting sort of to think about in many different contexts.
Dhruv?
This one. Yeah, you know, I'd like to... yeah, I have a speaker. I have a mic, sorry. No, but you know, there's also another trend in some of the disciplines in the light of the new crisis of the Anthropocene and all that. For example, I mean, a couple of days back, my wife gets a phone call from an environmental scientist. How do we decolonize the environmental sciences? All right? Now, the thing is that it's a problem because there's a tension between environment and ecology. All right? And the environmental economists just factor in nature as another variable in the economic models. Whereas the ecological economics is looking at things very, very differently. You want to restructure the whole thing. And so decolonizing now becomes a metonym, right? I mean, for something else to basically challenge the existing world order in a certain way, or the information order or the economic order. So, I mean, you will see a lot of the term being used outside, used in the discipline, but outside what we have discussed here. You know, so the same term is used, but it's used in a very different way. I mean, yeah.
Well, I would suggest as a kind of minimalist starting point that we should remain in conversation and see what comes of it. And if anybody didn't have any profound closing remarks, I would invite us downstairs for a glass of wine.
I think we need to thank Ben and everybody from the Einstein Forum.